Sikhs from around the world by showcasing their professions, passions, and perspectives. I'm your host, Mandheer Singh, aka the Nihung. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa.
Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Jvala Singh, welcome to the Nihung's Arena.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited. Just to give people a little bit background on you, you are an academic, author, lawyer. You're a lecturer at the University of California, Berkeley, creator of the Suraj Podcast, and you authored a book, 54 Punjabi Proverbs. And you are also currently doing a PhD at the University of British Columbia.
Correct. Yeah, all of that.
A lot of stuff on your plate.
It's been busy. Yeah. So, I mean, sorry for delaying so long. You've been reaching out to me for months and months, maybe over a year now, asking me to come on. And because of all that, because I'm quite busy, not had the time, but I'm happy to jump on now. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. So I came across you with your Suraj Podcast. Phenomenal work. You're going to be a little controversial for a lot of my audience, so I might as well throw that out there a little bit. But I think one thing that's missing, especially for people that live in like Canada, US, and the UK, we are very disconnected from the original history, the original writings. So we rely a lot on reinterpretations of things and very liberal editing of those things to maybe present a specific picture. And for me, I'm familiar, like Ratan Singh Pangu's Panth Prakash. I was familiar with Santokh Singh, but kind of it was framed in a different way than from what I heard when I heard you actually talking about it and going through it. But for me, whether you actually believe it literally or not, it is those original texts that were written in the time closest to the Guru's periods. And it's important for us to understand what was written because you get a lot of clues. Whether you believe it literally or not, you're getting a lot of clues into what was happening in the environment, what was the political environment, what was the social environment, and why was the Guru so driven and so like single-minded focus on setting up a panth, right? So I really, really appreciate what you did. It is so incredible because people like me, we read Gurbani. We have some basic understanding of Gurbani. We can read history books that are written in English. I try to read those, Dr. Sangat Singh's, History of the Sikhs and whatever you can get your hands on. But the difficulty is when historical texts that are written in poetry style, you not only do you have to be able to read it and understand it, you have to be able to interpret it. And that's one thing that you did brilliantly with the Suraj Podcast. You took the original work, you took Mandheer Singh's work, you took other resources, Guru Bilas Patshain Shaving, Guru Bilas Patshain Dasmi, and you're referencing them and you put it together. And then you're telling a story but like, honestly, I listened to it and it's playing in my head like I'm watching an episode of Game of Thrones or something like that. The music you use, the tone you set, the way you explain the scenery is so in depth. So if you don't mind, just talking about the Suraj Podcast for a little bit, Can you go into a little bit like how you were able to do that kind of work and exactly what does it take to put out a 10, 15-minute episode of the Suraj Podcast?
Well, yeah, sure. I'll get into that. I just want to go back a little bit to kind of earlier on what you said, opening it up, talking about, I may be a little bit controversial for some of your audience. And what I want to stress here is that the majority of the work that perhaps might make people think that way is just me making accessible texts of our, tradition. So like you mentioned, Pangu's text, that has been translated. Suraj Prakash, the Santokh Singh's text that you mentioned, which is what the Suraj Podcast is. What I do, as you mentioned, is I just go chapter by chapter. The Suraj Prakash text is just an enormous text. It's, over 1,200 chapters. It's the largest single piece of Sikh literature that we have ever written.
Yeah.
And that covers the history of Guru Nanak up to Guru Gobind Singh. Whereas Panth Prakash mainly deals with the 18th century, so into the 1700s, how the Singhs, then how the Khalsa Panth, established their Raj, their kingdom there. But Suraj Prakash specifically is just dealing with the stories of the Gurus. And, how I was able to do what I do in terms of, looking at the podcast, it took many years. I started out first just looking at specific passages that I would want to translate. And I have a blog, mangalacharan.com, where whatever I found interesting when I was looking at old texts, whether it be Pangus, Panth Prakash, Suraj Prakash, Sarblo Granth, there's portions of Dasam Granth I put up, Gurbalas Pachai Chemi, all these texts written in the 18th century. Basically, I would skim them, I would look through them, what kind of popped out. I thought, oh, that's interesting. So I wanted to dissect that, wanted to translate that. And I thought, if I'm doing that for my sake, why not throw that online as well? At least one person is going to be interested in that, other than me. It's not going to be a big audience, but that was not ever the point. If somebody's interested in that, that's great. However few people. And, through that practice of translation. So like you mentioned, I take help from Veer Singh and others. So Veer Singh, what he has done when he's published Suraj Prakash in the 1930s is that he's put footnotes sometimes explaining, the more difficult words in that text. And you mentioned that the text is in poetry. The text is set up in chapters. So like each prasang, each katha, each story is like a chapter long. And that would be like 40 to 60 verses, depending on the chapter. And it's a poetic meter. So there are some commentaries on Suraj Prakash. People have written underneath the lines in Punjabi, albeit a little loosely, to be honest. And online on gurmatvichar.com, you can find people doing gatha of the text. So this is a text that since, Santokh Singh wrote this in the 1840s, we know at least by 40 years after that text had spread. People were doing katha of that text at all the takats, basically, like, Akal Takat, Anandpur Sahib, and elsewhere. That text had just become like the gold standard of historical texts at that time, and continues to be. So even people to this day have recorded every single chapter of that text, and it's on gurmatvichar.com. I happen to like Sandhyani Indrajit Singh's katha on Suraj Prakash, and I listen to that. So that's what I do as well. So, okay. I've been covering on the podcast Guru Hargobind's katha, Guru Hargobind's history. So what I'll do is I'll listen to katha of that I find online of that portion that I'm looking to translate. Then I'll sit down and look at the commentary, and then I'll try to translate it myself. And I'll try to see, okay, if there's difficult portions, I'll kind of lean heavier on the katha. If there's portions where I think that the commentary perhaps has been loose in the translation, I'll try to provide a more accurate translation of that. And oftentimes, like you mentioned, sometimes I have to give context. I have to explain, okay, this at that time, people were doing these certain things. These were certain customs, perhaps at that time people were doing, because some of it is a little, it is different than what you read today. And that's what I found so interesting about the text, is that it presents history in such a different lens than how like you read a modern take on Sikh history, that I just found it so interesting. I'm like, and it was imbued with such flavor. And like you mentioned that when you listen to an episode, you feel like you're there. Yeah. So I'm literally just reading out what Santokh Singh has written. I'm doing it in English, but he's the one who's painting those pictures, right? Okay. I may add to it by throwing some, music around it that I see, that will help the vibe, right? That'll help. But you also modernize the language a little bit, right? Like several times you've referenced making it rain. I feel like that helps make it relatable for a lot of people. That specific reference, though, that is actually like the line. It says, I think the word is vodka or badka.
Oh,
It
right.
literally means. So even they're employing the same idiom that we would use now, like make it rain, like throwing money up. They were also using that.
Okay.
They were also making that idiom as well. So sometimes, like how old is that text? Nearly 200 years. They're using the similar idioms, which is funny, right? But sometimes you're right. Sometimes you have to change it up just so that it will be received properly. Because oftentimes, like, this is a problem that we have. Sometimes we read Gurbani translations and something. We're like, we don't understand the English. How are we going to understand, because they're using English from like the 1950s or 20s or something, right? So
it's a very Bible-like English. Right, that old English, like they got to use words like thou and things like that, and of course that becomes unrelatable. And then the other challenge you run into is the lost in translation, thing. Like there's just some things that you try to say it one way, and it's going to conjure an image. Like for example, we don't have to go into this now, but like just the idea of using the word God instead of saying Waheguru or something else. God has a very Christian imagery, so. Not that I don't think there's anything wrong with using the God, but you have to be aware of what subconsciously is going to come up in someone's mind because of the societies we live in and because of the weight that word has already established.
Absolutely. That's what makes translation so difficult, is that you really need to know how a certain word is going to be interpreted on both sides of that. So how it was written, at that time, and then how it will be interpreted today. So, I mean, that is the real big challenge in terms of conveying information. And, Gurbani is using all these terms that we don't use today. So, it takes a lot for us to think about that. But yeah, that is a huge challenge for anybody in this field.
Well, I think you navigate it very well. And I think that was the thing. Like I said, it's very vivid, but it's also very relatable because you're saying it in English, but you're careful about what words you use. But I was surprised because I like I said, I'm not able to read it, interpret it. Even if I read it, I'm not really understanding what I'm reading. It's just kind of just mechanical reading. So when you're describing things, it hit me. It struck me how much detail is there. Like Kavi Santokh Singh is describing the blow came from the right side, went down from the left shoulder to the right hip, that amount of detail, if nothing else. I was trying to explain this to somebody recently because they were like, oh, I just focus on the Gurbani, I don't believe, these things. And I'm like, that's fine. You don't have to, but it is our written history. But one of the points I tried to make to him was like, if we made a movie today about the Sikhs and you had like James Cameron directing this movie or whatever, or whoever, the J.J. Abrams or one of the new guys, whatever, they're going to take some type of artistic liberty to convey things. But so like, just because we watch Braveheart, right, and we get so inspired at that story of Braveheart, well, somebody had to take the artistic liberty to say, this guy's going to run this way and that guy's going to clash here and this one guy's going to get beheaded. So I can see that. And it kind of struck me. I was like, yeah, you know what? Today we would watch a movie, but in those days you needed people like Santokh Singh to inspire you with the storytelling, not just tell the story, right? It's not a documentary. It's meant to inspire that these were the qualities of the gurus. These were the qualities of the Sikhs that followed that guru.
Yes, absolutely. And he's doing something that is continuing a tradition that has been set by the gurus. Number one, just firstly on that sword, strike. We even know from contemporary sources, there was a Zoroastrian who kind of traveled India and he wrote this little book, Dabistan it's called, where he interviews different groups, different traditions. He interviewed some Sikhs as well. And even those Sikhs at those times, he actually met Guru Har Gobind and Guru Har Rai. Even those Sikhs at those times were talking about, oh, this is the type of strike. It didn't mention specifically, but it was mentioning this is like, they knew at that time, oh, the Guru did this type of strike, which is so insane and fascinating to know. Yeah. And so Santokh Singh is kind of carrying this tradition on because those references are mentioned in previous texts from the 1700s in Gurbalas Pache Shemi. Santokh Singh is then using that information and presenting it in an even more vivid light.
I see.
But in terms of inspiring and kind of making it your own, even if we look at Chandi Divar, Guru Gobind Singh's version of like a very older story of Durga, Pavani, Pagoti, in his version, he has guns. This is a mythological story, right? There's no guns back in the day, right? And in the old Indic texts, there was no guns. There was sword, arrows. But in Guru Gobind Singh's version, he's talking to an audience that has guns, right? So he's like, you know what? I'm going to put guns in this version. So that I find is like really interesting in how somebody can engage with an old text, repurpose it, and make it applicable to an audience of their time, right? And that's what I feel like we're doing today as well, especially on the podcast, right? So we're looking at Santokh Singh's text, we're trying to interpret it, we're trying to use terminology that is not deviating from the original, and we're changing it because that has happened when looking at these texts. But what we're going to do is, be accurate, but contextualize it and say, okay, why is the poet, why is the author using this? Is it referenced in the story prior to this? So oftentimes texts like Suraj Prakash will get criticized. Why is it including this story? Why is it saying this? Santokh Singh is just an expert referencer. And you can actually look back into the text of the 1700s, 18th century. And you'll find much of what you find controversial in Santokh Singh's text. He's just taking that from a tradition that he inherited that comes before him. So all of which to say, this kind of repurposing and making it applicable is a tradition that has been used by the gurus themselves, and using stories like Haranakish and Prahalad, right? That's not a Sikh story. In Rehras at the start, we say Haranaksha, Dusht Haramariya, Prahalad Taraya. That's a story that comes from another tradition. Right. We're taking it as an example and using it to prove a different point, right? Yeah. That the divine protects his devotees, right? Not to say that, we have to, give a thumbs up to every single thing in their tradition that they use, right?
Yeah, no, and I think we see this in just modern movies and art and stories anyway. Like, we've seen different versions of this Batman, right? It's the core story, the core lessons are the same. The question between being a vigilante and being a criminal, where's the line? What about the motivation? Using fear as a tactic to get what you want. Those are the common themes, but the story has been retold depending on the artist who wants to tell that story with some, different tones. Like the Batman, the new movie, is very different than the original ones with Michael Keaton. And so, they have totally different tones, even though same characters, same storyline. So yeah, it's interesting to think of it that way. But I do have a question for you. This has actually bugged me, but somehow it made sense because I followed along completely just fine. But why did you start with Bidhi Chand and Guru Hargobind? So first of all, why did you start with Guru Hargobind Sahib out of the whole text? And then why go out of order with his story and start with Bidhi Chand?
Because the simple answer is there was no master plan. There was no plan even to start a podcast.
Oh, okay.
Basically, my engagement with the Suraj Prakash text is I'm doing a PhD and my dissertation is going to focus on this text specifically. And to do that, I wanted to get a good grasp of the text. So I started listening to Katha as much as I could. And I really enjoyed the Katha of Guru Hargobind, specifically because Guru Hargobind's time is when you see this dramatic change in the tradition, right?
Right.
And through that contrast and through that change, you get almost a really deep understanding of, what is the essence here? Because there were many Sikhs at that time that saw that change and they were confused. They were wondering, why is the Guru doing this? Is this a deviation? Is this a fall to the Guru? People had those questions. Bhai Gurdas addresses those questions, right?
Yeah. So wait, hang on real quick right there. Sorry, I don't mean to keep interrupting you, but when you say these kinds of things, they spark things. And I just got to ask, it's interesting that you're saying that and listening to it, I was like, of course, people don't change ever. They were the same during Guru Sahib's time as they are today. Similarly, people today will say that can't be Guru Hargobind Sahib. That can't be true because the Guru would have been like Guru Arjan Dev Ji, or you know what I mean. And then the fact that people, even in Guru Hargobind Sahib's time, questioned the same way, like, is this the correct behavior of a guru? That was fascinating to hear that.
Yeah, and this is why I really love these texts as well, is that like the person writing this text is a human. The people that he's talking about are humans, and they go through human emotions and human questions and human doubt and human experience. And that comes out when you read these texts. And even Bhai Gurdas, like if you read him, you get it as well. He's talking about these issues as well. And that's what makes it really like striking. But, and of course, in these stories, then you have questions and answers with the Guru, which are insanely fascinating, because a lot of the questions that you have during, in these texts, people, you hear them at like a Sikhi camp, or you hear them at like a SSA, university meeting. Right. Students are like, why do we do this? Why do we do that? You have the same questions. And now we get, people like Kavi Santokh Singh, who are just renowned scholars, writing answers to these questions based on old sources, which I find is just like so amazing. But sorry, going back to the original question about how we kind of get started with Guru Hargobind, it was just, and the whole podcast as a whole was just, I was listening to Katha, I found things interesting. I have a group of friends who I was listening to the Katha. And listening to Katha itself is difficult in the sense that the Katha is in Punjabi, so you need a base knowledge of Punjabi. But even people who understand Punjabi, there's a certain kind of set of terminology that is not, you'd have to really dig into it to get comfortable just listening to Katha over and over again. So a lot of my friends, they were not listening to that. I would send them audio notes of, oh man, this in this jang, this happened, in this battle, this happened. The Guru answered this question about this, and they were fascinated. I was telling them about the Bidhi Chand story, and I'd send them audio notes of it. And the audio notes, started to pile up, and we were like, why don't we just record these audio notes? Actually, it wasn't even my idea. It was my friend's idea. Like, why don't we record the audio notes, polish it up, because I was just sending it to them offhand, and we'll just get through Bidhi Chand stories. Like, this was kind of the initial plan, right? Which is like basically where we started, was about halfway through Guru Hargobind's time as Guru. Not a especially good place to start if you're trying to do it chronologically. And but so we said, okay, let's try this out, and we started to put some music around it. We had no idea how long this would last, if we're going to do only 5 episodes, 10 episodes. I'm recording this with you now, we're at 210 plus, I think. So
I'm caught up to 207. So,
crazy.
Yeah. I mean, you don't understand. I almost got obsessive with it. There was a point where I was getting frustrated that you only put them out 10, 15 minutes at a time. I was like, give me a good hour or two here. I was doing these, I flip houses, and I have a project. I'm in Michigan. I have a project in New Jersey. So I would drive 9.5 hours back and forth. So I listen to a lot of Joe Rogan and stuff. I know that's also going to get some eye rolls or whatever, but you don't know what you're talking about. So, but I also listened to Suraj Podcast, Mandheer Singh. He was actually my last guest a couple of weeks ago. And I would listen to him, and then I would listen to the Suraj Podcast, and I would get just totally lost in it. And so I was always curious about that, like why you picked Guru Hargobind Sahib to start with, and then why specifically Bidhi Chand, and they kind of go back, but that makes a lot of sense. So where did you get the education to be able to do this? You're born in Canada?
Yeah. So born and raised in Ottawa, actually, outside of the capital of Canada.
Yeah.
Some 4 hours east of Toronto. And, I was born there, raised there. After my undergrad, I actually went to India to study Gurbani Santhya for about 6 months. Spent some more time with my teacher after that, Sant Gyani Indrajit Singh. And then through that, slowly, I started being able to translate text. And, it's a skill that is still polishing up, still refining. And I'm sure there's plenty of mistakes along the way. And I ask for forgiveness for all of that. But it's a part of the podcast itself is an endeavor to get better at translating. So
yeah, interesting.
Initially, the first few episodes, I would look at a podcast and I'd give kind of a sankhep of it, a kind of a summary of, okay, in this chapter, these are the things that happen. But as I went along, I started to think, why not use this as an opportunity, like to get better at translating and translate every single line? So that then increased the amount of effort that went into each episode. And that's why I don't release them that often. I'm trying to release them as often as I can, but each episode takes about 2-3 hours at least. An hour and a half, 2 hours maybe on translating, because there's about 40 to 60 verses per chapter. And each episode is just one chapter. And, that's a lot of translation. I have to sit there, I have to listen to the katha, I have to use dictionaries, etc. So my training then was, looking at the specific language in this text is called Braj Bhasha.
Yeah.
Some people call it Brij Bhasha as well in Punjab. Usually they'll change it to Brij. And it's the same language that is used for Guru Gobind Singh Ji's Bani a lot, and also Guru Tegh Bahadur's Bani. Some of Aud Guru Granth Sahib is using that as well. And so it became a perfect exercise for me, get these stories out. They're really interesting. They're really fascinating. They're really captivating in the way that the poet has kind of structured, setting the scene, setting the emotion, plot building, character building. There's so many levels where you could just dive in and just enjoy how the poet Santokh Singh is kind of constructing these stories, because he's really a curator. He has this vast library that came before him that was written in the 1700s. And he's curating that information, and he's doing so skillfully that you do feel like you're there, and you do humanize with both the Sikhs at that time and the Guru themselves. Like so many comments that I've gotten, people inboxing me saying, it really humanizes the Guru. And I always thought I was not sure what type of reaction would come from this podcast, but that was one that kind of shocked me a little bit, because it's not to say that there's not portions of the text which relate to miracles and which relates to mythology, right? But because there's the text is so imbued with emotion and like flavor that people just are captivated by that, and they can relate and they can feel the text, and they can feel the Guru in a sense, right? And that's why you have people that are like, I'm going to focus on Gurbani and not look at Itihas history. But it becomes very difficult. Like you see the younger generations, it's like, why? This is a question that many students and younger people have, is like, if you don't have a connection with Guru Nanak, with Guru Angad, Guru Amar Das, Guru Ram Das, Guru Arjan Dev Ji, Guru Har Gobind, like all the gurus, how are you going to be interested in what they wrote?
No, that's really interesting. Actually, the way I think about it, because some people could say, well, we shouldn't humanize the gurus; they were above us or whatever. I'm not thinking of it that way. I'm thinking in the sense that it makes them like you realize that they were real people. They're not also mythology. They're not just stories. They were real people making military decisions, or they were real people making family decisions and social decisions. And you kind of also realize that, because we think, I used to do this exercise. It's I probably stole it from somebody, but like with camps or retreats, like how would you act if Guru Gobind Singh was sitting here in the Divan Hall right now? They'd be, I would sit straight. I would listen to everything he says. I would follow whatever he says. Like, well, Guru Granth Sahib is here. That's your Guru. It's here. And so why aren't you acting like that now? Right. But it's because we have a hard time thinking of the Guru as a real person. Like Guru Nanak Dev Ji was a 15-year-old kid at one point. He was a 25-year-old young man still teaching people, right? I mean, we lose track of that the Gurus were actual people. So when I hear humanizing them, I don't think of it as like bringing them down to the human level and suffering the human condition of Kam, Krodh, Lobh, Mohankar. They were above that. And they showed us how to be above that, but they were real people. And that's one thing that comes out. And you're right, like the miracles and the mythology and stuff. I don't know how to take that. I started to think of it like, actually, I got this from the Suraj Podcast when the Nihung Mandheer Singh was on, and he was talking about, like some of the paintings of Guru Gobind Singh with 8 arms. He's like, this is not to represent him as a goddess. with 8 arms. It was representing the 8 hand strikes in martial arts, that he was a master of these 8 hand strikes. That's what that painting represents. So then I started thinking, okay, so the angels, these angels of death come down and devour bodies, or the devtas of the mountain winds and stuff coming down and they take out the armies. I'm like, this is an artistic representation of how this battle's being won. It doesn't necessarily literally mean that, which I think that's where the controversy comes in. People hear this and they go, oh, that's just a bunch of mythology and foolishness. Well, there's a lot of mythology in Guru Granth Sahib too, right?
This is the thing. There's a couple of things I want to mention on this. First of all, you're absolutely correct that the same type of criticism that people lay on texts like Panth Prakash, Suraj Prakash, etc., engaging in Indic mythology, the same type of mythology is engaged in Guru Granth Sahib.
Yeah.
You can look, just plugging my YouTube page, Jvala Singh. There's a talk on there I did with AKFA, a UK Punjabi Heritage Association, called The Merit of Myth. And it kind of goes into deeper understanding about what is myth actually doing. Like you mentioned Batman earlier, right? Yeah. And you were talking on a level that was like, oh, what are the narratives underneath the actual story? Right. Like you talked about good versus evil, about how to engage with pain or some of these elements that you were talking about, right? And that's a deeper understanding. Most people are just going to look at the story and be like, oh, Batman beat Joker up and this and that, right? Right. But you can see then how these stories are layered, right? For some of the audience, like a younger audience, they're going to be like, oh, awesome. Batman beat up X and Y and Z. So therefore, maybe it's good to be strong. Maybe I should stand up for myself. Maybe I should exercise, as a young kid, maybe I should do Taekwondo or whatever. But the adult's going to look at that and be like, ooh, this is very interesting. Like, do you let anger overpower you to make an incorrect decision, even though it's for the better good of society? You can see how the storytelling there is structured in a way that it's appealing to various audience. In the same way, I argue that Suraj Prakash and these type of texts in Guru Granth Sahib, Dasam Guru Granth Sahib, etc., they're doing the same type of thing. To a certain audience, they're presenting the idea. Like there was the first jung that we covered in Suraj Podcast, I believe. The Mughal forces had been sent in improperly, kind of equipped. They sent into the forest. It was in winter and all this. And the way the poet there describes how like Pawan Devta, like the god of wind, basically came through, and it made it very difficult for the Mughal warriors because it was cold to then use their matchlock rifles. And if you didn't know anything about matchlock rifles, you'd be like, you wouldn't know how to be properly equipped or like the kind of requirements that you would need to do to make sure that, the army would be well fared to fight, kind of a guerrilla warfare in a forest. Yeah. How are you going to explain that in a poetic text? Well, are you going to use Indic, you're going to use mythology to say that, oh yeah, like Pawan Devta came through and made it difficult for them, where he didn't do that for the Sikhs. The Sikhs, he explains this. So he provides both sides. Yeah. So if you're a military person and you listen to that story, you're like, oh, that makes perfect sense. Like the Sikhs had little fires that they were using to kind of light their match. And, you're able to see both sides of it.
Which, by the way, I learned about all of that from you. Matchlock rifles and all, and how the Sikhs were able to load quicker. That was fascinating. Another thing I kind of connected. You could probably tell I'm a movie buff and a comic book guy, or whatever. But one thing that kind of struck me too was when you're talking about just the style of the warfare, the inspiration they get. And I started to think about that. Like today, if I was going to battle and I'm part of the U.S. Special Forces or something, and I'm coming to special team, I might be like the guy that's got the Superman patch on my shoulder, right? What does that patch do? Does it mean that I believe there's a guy that flies through the sky that's indestructible? Or does it kind of remind me of the mentality I need and warn my enemies of the kind of guy I am? Like this guy,
absolutely.
You know what I mean? So when you watch like the Avengers or anything like that, if you have an Incredible Hulk tattoo or something, you kind of get the idea that guy is not afraid. He's coming in here like he thinks he's the Incredible Hulk. It can cause an intimidation factor. So to have references to things like Hanuman and other things that people would be aware of as superhero types that are above human capability and could strike fear in your heart, the hearts of their enemies, and inspire you to perform at a different level. That you kind of helped me make that connection with, before I would have been like, oh, come on. They weren't Hindu worshipers. Why would someone write this? But I think hearing it in that context, now I don't know whether they were or not either. I'm also interpreting things looking back, but I could see that. I could all of a sudden I was like, wait a minute, I have a Superman t-shirt that I like to wear. Why do I wear that? It's not because I believe in this mythology. It's because it's inspiring me, and it's telling, and other people look at me and they go, oh, he's wearing Superman. He's a good guy or something,
No, that's a great way to think about it in terms of what does it represent? Not the literal, right? Like you have texts in the 1700s, which is like Khalsa thought of themselves as Hanuman in the sense that they were strong, they were devoted to their divine, and they were basically the muscle.
Yeah.
And in the same sense, like Guru Hargobind, this comes up in the podcast when Bidhi Chand kind of goes behind enemy lines, and he brings back those horses.
Yeah.
There's a certain type of analogy here about how Hanuman went behind lines and he brought Sita back and stuff, or news of Sita back.
Right.
And so it uses that reference, not to be like, okay, now we all of a sudden have to take every single fact of Hanuman literally.
Right.
It's just giving, okay, what does the audience know about? What are the analogies that we can use that will represent what it means, right? Like Hanuman was like that person that was just so devoted to Ram, right?
Yeah.
In the same way, Bidhi Chand was so devoted to Guru Hargobind.
Right.
When Bidhi Chand died, it says in the text, not only in Suraj Prakash, but in Guru Bilas Padshah Chemi, text from the 1700s, Guru Hargobind was extremely sad after that. Like he missed Bidhi Chand so much. That was his right-hand man, right? Throughout his whole life, Bidhi Chand was there. That it really affected Guru Hargobind. So, you're going to use references that people understand, and you're going to take up ideas and ideals that are inspiring you. And I think this is what Guru Gobind Singh himself is doing, right? He's distributing Amrit, that nectar which makes you immortal, right? To who? To his Akalis, to his immortal warriors. Like his warriors are beyond death. They've already, drank death. We've consumed it. We are beyond that, right? So you have to kind of think in those ways where it's beyond the literal. And then these ideas and these references and these stories, they all start to make sense a little bit more than the literal, right?
So obviously you must have been inspired what was your Sikhi upbringing? What, like in your family, did you have any, or did it come later, or was it always there? And then how did you get inspired to start thinking, I want to translate text. I want to understand deeper. Like, where did that come from?
Sikhi Gurbani came from my father, who would kind of recite, who would teach me how to recite Gurbani, Japji Sahib when I was very young. My mom in the same way, every day reciting Japji Sahib in the morning before eating, etc., etc. So it came from there. My father was really into it.
So it was there in the family. Yeah, it
was there in the family, and then slowly, through I guess the people around me, I started getting interested in the older texts. Specifically the older texts present the history in a different light. And that always confused me. And that was always something that bugged me, but in a way that I'm like, okay, I want to understand this further. So even while, I was a teenager, I was young, I'd be maybe playing games or something. I like first person shooters like Counter-Strike or what have you. Yeah. And I would have like a grunt on the side anyways. So like there's rounds and you play and then you die or something. You have to wait for the round to restart. I'd just kind of be like skimming through like, what's the controversy about Dasam Granth? This was a big thing in like the late 90s, early 2000s on like Sikh forums, which I used to frequent. And I was like, oh, this is really interesting. Like, what's the deal? Like, none of it made any sense to me growing up, which is why I was like, I would look at it and be like, oh, one day, like, I'm going to try to understand this. So slowly, I just kind of read it. And then there was portions in there that I thought, okay, if I can translate this, that would help me. And then it would help somebody else. So I put it online. And it just kind of grew from there, where I was just started reading more and more, started talking to more people. I was introduced to different teachers. Mandheer Singh was one of them that really inspired me. And I was lucky to spend time with them, and they would kind of take me through these texts as well. So, I mean, family, friends, and then scholars.
So you had it kind of around you, and it just kind of came out of that. But one thing that I noticed on your website, the mangalacharan.com website, because you have a lot of stuff from Guru Gobind Singh, and then I don't want to get too controversial here. I don't care. I just want people to understand that there are other perspectives out there, and there's a reason or a resource or a reference to why these other perspectives exist. Like, okay, fine. You want to be against bhang, you want to be against any kind of cannabis use because you have a certain understanding of Sikhi and Gurbani based in something, fine. But understand that the people that maybe do use it or do understand it differently, there is a reference for it. They're just not making it up. And one thing that you had pointed out was that there have been changes in the Dasam Granth, that before there was a reference to maybe bhang that was changed later to references of like Nam or something other to make it kind of more palatable. How do you know when these edits? Because the other people will claim it's the other way around, that it was changed into that to confuse people.
Well, I do want to clarify here.
Okay.
I don't think I've ever said that Dasam Granth itself was edited. There's work on this in terms of like the printed manuscript, what we have today, the Soda committee that came in, but nothing in regard to Sukha or Bhang or anything like that has been edited out as far as I know. And there was a comment. I did listen to some of your talk with Amar Singh, Suraj Podcast, and I was really touched by the comments at the end, praising Suraj Podcast and all that. Amar Singh did say something there that I mentioned, like Suraj Prakash was edited. That I want to clear up as well. To my knowledge, Suraj Prakash itself has not been edited. Veer Singh has edited other texts like Panth Prakash. That has now come out, and which is clear to people from the work of Professor Balwant Singh Dillon. He's come out with some work on that. But Dasam Granth itself has not been edited, as far as I know, in terms of, taking portions out that relate to Sukha, cannabis. But in terms of interpretation, for sure, at the end, so like Guru Granth Sahib ends with Atharan Das Bees in Ragmala, also, anyways, we don't have to go into that debate.
Yeah, that's a whole other thing. That's okay.
And then Dasam Guru Granth Sahib ends with Bidesa Kya Sagras Sabaz Gu Gemara Bakaras Jang Andru. This is from the Hakayata. And in that, people take that as being Sukha, cannabis, there, a reference to that. But in terms of like these old texts, basically the way that I kind of look at that is that we have to give deference to the people that were compiling and writing these texts more so than how we understand it. So, for example, just looking, we've all, heard that Guru Har Gobind went to battle. Mm-hmm. If you look at Guru Granth Sahib, there's lines in there like Jote Marun Mukhi Tirana Mare Kum. If somebody punches you, Mukhi, Tirana Mare Kum, don't hit him back. Or the line is something to the kind of, don't hit them back.
I'll put the line down there for, go ahead.
Yeah. You should kiss their feet and then go home. Don't hit them back. So with those types of understandings, people could go and say, okay, Guru Har Gobind is not adhering to what Gurbani would say. Mm-hmm. There's ways of interpreting Gurbani that you could put a different frame on any line in Gurbani and frame it as, okay, there's an injunction here, there's a permission here. There's lines like Thanda Pani Piyo.
Yeah.
Rukhi Sukhi Khai Ke Thanda Pani Piyo. This is Farid's line. That says, okay, drink cold water. So you're not going to have chai, you're not going to have any other, any other type of drink, Coke, etc., Sprite. You could take lines like that and interpret them very literally, and then make whatever type of prescriptions you want. So what I'm doing through like sites the post on Manglacharan is just presenting, okay, what did people of that time, what did they write about? So for example, Santokh Singh and both like Santokh Singh and Ratan Singh Pangu write about, Sukha, cannabis use in the culture. And then you have also lines in the 1700s writing about that as well. And if anything, that should just make us think, okay, what has changed in our culture from now and then? We don't have to accept it. We don't have to say like, okay, we all have to do this now all of a sudden. It's just making us think a little bit more deeper about, okay, what are some of the changes? Because a lot of the changes that have occurred are just, we're so blind to. For example, in Punjabi culture, we think, okay, cha is like a Punjabi thing. And we get really angry when somebody says, oh, don't say chai. It's cha. Cha is Punjabi, but cha is not even our thing. Nobody was drinking cha before the British came into Punjab. Right.
They introduced it. Right.
Yeah. But now it's become so associated with Punjabi culture. Right. And not to say that association was wrong or whatever in the past.
Yeah. Just things evolve. They come from somewhere, they evolve. Everything works that way.
Right. And what were people drinking before that, and how we understand, I think it's really important that we should know that these conceptions about intoxicants, are very Western, right? The ones that we hold now in terms of, okay, like, for example, alcohol is not a drug, but, in a Western mentality, right? There's alcohol and then there's drugs.
Right. Separate.
But how different, and there's some really good work on this now, like caffeine, is caffeine not an intoxicant? Is caffeine not something which affects, one's mental state? Because
no, 100% it is. Yeah.
You have, a double espresso and
people can't live without coffee. They can't even get their day started without it.
Right. And meanwhile, and then that's like extremely addictive, right? People who drink coffee every day, you take them out for a week and they suffer, right?
Yep.
And it becomes very difficult for them to do any work. Meanwhile, they'll criticize things which are not addictive physically. So all of which to say that things change, things evolve over time, things get adapted as part of the culture, things get rejected part of the culture. These things happen over time. And I find that it's interesting just looking at history, like how do these notions change? And then how do interpretations of Gurbani change? Because, for example, when we look at Santokh Singh, this is somebody that's not who's not read Gurbani. Santokh Singh has written his Tika, his commentary on Japji Sahib is, I think, one of the most complicated and sophisticated interpretations of Japji Sahib I've ever seen. This is not somebody that has not read through, who is not imbued with Gurbani. And then we're sitting here on our computers to read English translations. We read on the weekend, little bits, and we're dealing with people that have studied these texts and who have lived the life, their whole life. Like even Ratan Singh Pangu becomes a shaheed fighting against the British. These people are not unaware of certain passages where you're going to be like,
they've read the same Gurbani and they understand it much better than most likely any of us do. Yeah.
We have very little understanding Gurbani in comparison, all of us. So in my mind is, okay, let's give a little bit of deference to these legends, even the people that we think as legends, like Bhai Veer Singh, they thought Santokh Singh and Bhai Ratan Singh Pangu were like legends,
Right.
They were writing at a time when they were trying to contextualize different things, saying that, okay, we should stop. They had vices during that time and they were trying to edit and commentate on these issues. But, they also held people like Santokh Singh and Veer Singh as legends, all I'm trying to say. So, now we're just rambling on.
Yeah, no. And the whole cannabis thing, even in the United States, this is really an issue that comes up in the early 1900s. Because there was actually a marketing campaign away from hemp because it could have replaced wood paper products, and the paper companies were marketing against hemp and actually got legal action by lobbying against hemp, and that changed the tone of how cannabis was treated for 100 years now. So yeah, our understanding of it is very different. I just want to be clear though. I'm not condoning it. I don't know enough about it. I actually don't know enough about the history and the references to say whether it is or isn't. I mean, we do know for a fact that cannabis was used as pain medicine and treating wounds and things like that on the battlefield. But I don't know, and probably maybe as a fact otherwise, but I don't know that. But I know that our perception of it is way more negative than it ever would have been. Some natural remedy that grows out of the ground that you can use medicinally would have been treated much different.
That's a good way to think about it. It's like, what type of reaction are we giving to these references and why? Like, would we have the same reaction if, I scrape my knee, I'm going to go to the doctor and I'll get like a Tylenol 3, or I'm going to get, something prescription because, that's okay. Anything prescribed by a doctor, that's not like against my religion or anything like that. Versus kind of the reaction that we have against plants and against, flowers and stuff like that. So, just knowing like how these preconceived notions come to be, it's shocking, right? Like the effect that the culture can have on certain things like this. In Canada, like these laws came about to kind of stop immigration of Jamaicans coming into Canada. Like, this was, cannabis was used in Canada before that as medication. It was prescribed as well. And same with opium, also relating to racist, immigration laws. And then
interesting.
Yeah. And then we kind of, demonize substances like this and all I'm saying is that the demonization of certain substances is not, they're not doing it equally across the field. Like, Tylenol, anything prescribed, that's okay. But meanwhile, anything natural like that is going to be demonized. And there are people in the Panth, in the community, that don't drink caffeine because, they have this idea, like, we don't want to just, change our mental state in any way. And caffeine definitely changes your mental state. Yeah, absolutely. Right.
There's other problems with caffeine.
Being consistent.
If you're going to treat, if you're trying to look at it from an ethical point of view, like caffeine, they used to extract the caffeine from used tea leaves and then put it into these drinks. But now they actually extract it from coal tar, which is a byproduct of fossil fuels. So of the oil industry. So you could even argue that it's way worse ethically to consume caffeine than cannabis or anything else because of where it comes from now. It's not even a natural plant source anymore. And it's coming from a source that's arguably damaging the planet and hurting people's health outside of just the use of the drug itself. So
for sure hurting people's health. And in that regard, people will say, like, and another thing I want to address is also, like, even if you are anti any substance, which is a very fair point to have, like, wouldn't you want to know how certain communities over time utilize and maybe didn't utilize certain things? Like, that should be in your toolbox when addressing these subjects, if you're trying to curb perhaps abuse, right? And abuse occurs through everything from caffeine to sugar. I know we are going to like mandate like against sugar and gordoras and stuff. Like, we have an obesity.
If you leave it up to some people, they will try. There are people that would try.
Right. But all of which to say, like, abuse occurs through, not just the specific substances, through a whole range of things. And then we have to tackle the problem in a more sophisticated way, because just outlying certain things and not outlying other things, it's just inconsistent. I'm not sure if it's going to help, but anyways, in looking at these old texts, we can see, and that'll give a better insight as well for us. Like, why were these used? And perhaps these old texts talk about it. And that's what I'm trying to unearth, and just looking at the broader history as well, pre-colonial. So,
well, and not just Suraj Prakash, but like even Panth Prakash with Ratan Singh Pangu. Like I said, you look at them and you look for clues as to the environment of the time. And now Baisakhi, like today we had Amrit Sanchar this morning at our Gurdwara. We've been having Samagam like all weekend here, and people are excited. And I'm actually going to be doing a presentation on Baisakhi next weekend. And I've been going through, looking at stuff, trying to figure out, how to frame it. And one thing that we always heard the story, that Guru Gobind Singh stands on the stage and he asks for a head and everybody goes quiet. If you looked at it through the lens of how people act and talk today, why would anybody go quiet? We all are like, oh, I would give my head, like how come 10,000 people aren't raising their hands saying me first, so when you think about that story, then you start to think, okay, why didn't people want to jump on the stage for Guru Gobind Singh? Because we act like we would. And then you get clues in Panth Prakash that leading up to that time, many Sikhs had started to think that Guru Gobind Singh was crazy, that he had lost his mind, that he had lost his way, and they were going to Mata Gujari and complaining about him and asking her to do something and take over. So now when you kind of frame it that way, that you got 80,000 people, whatever they say it is, sitting out there, and Guru Gobind Singh comes on stage, draws his sword and says he needs a head. Now it makes sense. Now you're like, okay, I understand. People didn't know what to think. They thought he had lost his mind. They didn't know if he was really going to cut off a head or not. And whether he did or not, in the tent, I know some people will say, of course he did, and sewed them back on different bodies and put amrit in their mouth. Some people say, no, it's just a show, it was lamb's blood. And then other people say, whatever. That's not even the point. The point is, why didn't tons of people jump on the stage? Why did only 5 come up? And then you start to understand, people were competing for the Guru's attention, for their own gain, to become known as great. Where you had the Broad clan over here and you had this other clan here, and they're competing to be the best warriors for the Guru. They weren't really completely like the Gursikh ideological image we have, that they all wore like orange damallas and an orange kamarkasa with a blue chola, and they all did fateh and synchrony, you know what I mean? So then you start to realize they were real people. They were interacting with the Guru in a normal way. The very close Gursikhs who really understood him were the ones that were rare and unique, which is probably what we see today too. We claim 25 million Sikhs around the world. I'm guessing back then it was percentage-wise, it was probably the same few that were dedicated, others that were around the Guru, that called him their Guru, but they didn't know what to think, So when you start go ahead.
Sorry, isn't that why some of these old texts are so interesting? It's like, because right there, you're like, okay, we would have thought this way, that everybody would have jumped on. And in the old text, you get kind of a more gray, kind of a more interesting kind of picture, because that is, as we see today, like what you're saying, like not everybody is going to be, jumping on board. And I think what is so interesting to me in looking at like Suraj Prakash and what comes out on the podcast are those dynamics are like, in the family of the Guru, what are the dynamics like? Right. Like who's saying what? And like, you have that, right? Like the Masans during that time, Guru Gobind Singh's time, we're going to Mata Gujari and saying, this is not a good idea, like what he's doing. And those type of ideas are really fascinating to me, because we have this idealistic kind of thought of like, everybody's going to be like, thumbs up, jumping on board. But it's really interesting, kind of that dynamic. And it also shows you then, and this is the most interesting thing for me, is like, how does spirituality materialize in action for a Sikh? And that's something that comes out on the podcast and kind of in these old texts. So it's one thing for us to just kind of look at Gurbani and kind of in our own mind, try to imagine how that materializes. But like, and this is why Bhai Mani Singh wrote his Sikhani Bhagatmala, right? So in Bhai Gurdas's Vara, in his 11th Var, he writes a list of names of Sikhs, but he doesn't explain much. He just kind of lists their names. So in Bhai Mani Singh's time, early 1700s, Sikhs ask Mani Singh, like, Bhai Gurdas has written these names. Can you tell us stories about them? And he's like, yeah, I have stories on all of them. They're kind of back and forth, their dialogues. He's inherited these stories from the traditions as well. He spent time with the Guru and the close attendants of the Guru and the family, the wives and all that. So he writes these stories. And in those stories, then you get to see kind of the back and forth between the Sikhs and the Guru. And you also hear about, okay, like, for example, in the podcast as well, this comes out in Guru Balas Pachai Shemi, which is a text written at the behest of Bhai Mani Singh. Somebody's writing it, and Mani Singh's explaining what was happening during the time of Guru Hargobind. For example, Bhai Gurdas and Bidhi Chand, there's a portion in there where Bhai Gurdas actually kind of slips a little from his state, and he kind of runs away, essentially. He spends time in Kashi, in Banaras. He doesn't want to come back. He feels a little bit of ashamed, and then he comes back. And in these stories, it tells you that even though these people like are Brahmganis, they're close attendants of the Guru, even they can slip. Like anybody can slip. And just those type of insights, it's like, oh, that's really interesting. That's not maybe how we've perceived spirituality nowadays, in the sense that, oh, if a Brahmgani is always going to be a Brahmgani, anything they do is perfect. They show there that, people, can slip, and how spirituality materializes. Anyways, that's really fascinating to me, because it's really different.
Because, like, of course, now, again, that we have this imagination of what those Gursikhs would be like based on what we think we would do. It's really egotistical, because we think we would be this perfect follower, but really we're just as human as anybody else. And the Guru is going to say things and do things that aren't going to make sense to us. I can imagine if Guru Gobind Singh was here in physical form and he started to say something that we didn't agree with because the Ratmrada says something different, or because, we've been taught something different, and then we would be like, oh, no, he's wrong. We shouldn't do that. But the same person that would be like, I would do whatever the Guru says. Okay, well, the Guru says, instead of that bana, I want you to wear tactical gear, like pants and a tactical shirt. He'd be like, no, but this is Guru's bana. I can't do that. Oh, okay. That's really what you're doing is you've imagined what the Guru would want and how the Sikhs must have acted. But that's one thing that really comes out clear. Like even the relationships going in and out. Like I'm gonna start mixing up all the names, but there was I guess they were like from Kashmir. No, not from Kashmir, from Afghanistan. There was warriors that were with Guru Hargobind Singh. Like he was a younger guy, really strong.
Bande Khan. Yeah.
Bande Khan was really strong. The Guru favored him so much. Sikhs were jealous of the favor he got. And then later on, Guru Sahib has to battle him. Right? So imagine being that close with the Guru, having that much favor, and then something happens and now paths are crossed and now you're on the opposite side. I mean, that really highlights. And the other thing I got from that too was, I picked this up from your podcast. People consider themselves Sikhs of the Guru, but they didn't necessarily abandon their religious beliefs. So even though, like you had a Wazir Khan, the Gursikh, but he was still part of the Mughal Empire, but he considered himself a follower of the Guru, but he wasn't necessarily abandoning being a Muslim, right? Like that kind of personality trait. Like today, we're very clear. You're either this or you're that. And I got the feeling listening to it that people followed the Guru because they saw something beyond and not necessarily something in contrast to.
Yeah. And it also kind of points to pre-colonial different conceptions about identity as well, right? So, but yeah, no, you're 100%. There's lines, Guru Gobind Singh Janka, Shud Gale Param Urka, that person which has the illusion of Maya removed from their heart. This Age Hindu kya Turka. In front of them, who's a Hindu, who's a Turk? They just see Paramatma, right? It's not what's on the exterior. But for sure, like even like there's a story in the podcast about Babak Rababi. So Babak, you know, a very, very common Persian name. He's a Mughal. He's a Rababi. He's somebody who sings Gurbani. He performs Asa Divar every morning for Guru Har Gobind. He fights in the Jang as well. So he's a Surama. He's a warrior as well. Yeah. And when he passes away, he's buried. Like they don't cremate him because his family has these traditions. And this is something as well that I want to contextualize in regard to the weddings as well. People will say, you know, on the podcast, how come when you describe the weddings, they're so different than how we have weddings today? And I would say it's clear from pre-colonial sources that notions about, you know, birth rights, wedding rights, funeral rights, etc., have evolved in the community over time. And, you know, during the time of the gurus, perhaps they were not as kind of concrete as we have them today, which is fine. Things evolved just like things evolved with the Khalsa, Amrit Sanchar over time. And like one thing that it mentions in the text is that like that's Kul Reet. So it's the traditions of the family. It's not like a Sikh tradition. It's just like that, the family, that's how they used to do it for many, you know, generations. And they continued on with that generation, understanding that that's a familial tradition. And that's all it is. It's just a familial tradition. It's nothing beyond that. And so that's what they used to do. And that's the thing, like Babak Rababi had his funeral tradition.
Yeah.
And the Sikhs had their own, like they were cremated, etc.
What I took from that, the weddings and the funerals, is that Guru Sahib isn't concerned with the specific ritual, right? Like that doesn't matter. Even what we do now, it's just a ceremony. It's not really the important part, right? It's fine. It's evolved over time. And maybe it's important today to have those as our own identity, especially considering the political climate and things that were going on in Punjab and in India. But that actual part of it is not important. The important part is that there is a social witness to the wedding. There's a social witness to the funeral and how a person is honored and treated. And you have this kind of acknowledgement between everybody that this is where it happened. It didn't matter. It could have been in a church wedding or whatever, but now we have our traditions, but it wasn't the important thing. The important thing is more what comes out of it. You know, what is that relationship that comes out of it? So yeah, I definitely felt that. Yeah. Like just the way everything is kind of framed. Now, other things that kind of get a little touchy and controversial are, you know, like Guru Har Gobind Sahib has multiple wives, and then there's Konla. That's kind of a hard thing to fit.
Konla is an interesting case, especially because you see how the family reacts when she's kind of brought in, and Guru Har Gobind's like, we'll just kind of have her in the residence with, you know, his mother and his three wives, and basically Mata Gangaji is like, no, Konla's not staying with us. So they have to construct a different building. It's really interesting. And this is the thing as well. It's like, kind of throwing back to what you said earlier about like, in our mind, we're going to be like, oh, the Guru shouldn't do this. He should do this. Right. It's like, do we have the ability to say, when, you know, in our tradition, we say that the Guru is playing a game of so many more dimensions than we can see, right? So how are we going to ever judge if we can't even like see at what level they're playing at this entire game, right? This lila, this kale that they're constructing. So it becomes impossible for us to judge. But yeah, they're the three wives, and this is something that I think it's interesting how the poet Santokh Singh referenced this as, I think it was the second or the third marriage. It's just in a very quick line. He just says, like, just like a Maharaja, because the Guru had now become a Mir, like Miri and Piri. Piri, the spiritual, and Miri, the royal, the sovereign. Like at that time, if you were in royalty, if you were somebody that was kind of engaged politically and kind of in that way, you were making marriages with different families for, alliances.
It was
what
diplomacy. It was politics. It was a lot of things happening in a marriage.
Yeah. Right. So in that way, that's like one way that the poet Santokh Singh has kind of contextualized that. And it does make sense, right? Like that in that time period, that's how people were engaging with marriage. Like it was marriage. And even like Mata Marwahi's name, Marwahi is the name of the location of basically her family. Her real name was Mata Devi or Mahadevi, sorry. So like they weren't even really using in the text her name. Like it's always a throwback to like, okay, like that represents a family or an alliance that the Guru has constructed and etc. So that's one way to understand it. And these are definitely questions I get a lot in relation to that and that history. And this is a very difficult thing because it's not like it was ever debated. Like it's talked about now, right? In the last 20, 30 years, it's like, oh, like, does Sikhi support polygamy? And it's a very interesting question because, Guru Gobind Singh as well had 3 wives, right? So, and these are like not points that you can debate in the sense that like every pre-colonial text, even post-colonial, basically mentions this. So,
I don't know that it can't be debated. I mean, like I've heard people say like with Guru Gobind Singh that, okay, Mata Sahib Kaur, she's the mother of the Khalsa. He didn't really have a grishti relationship with her. And then Ajit Kaur and Sundari and Jito, they're the same person. It's just different names for the same person. And maybe like even Guru Har Gobind thing, I can tell you, I have a very hard time accepting it too. And but I'm aware of why, but I do have a hard time accepting it. The problem I have is the incredible amount of detail. When you see how much detail this person is from here, this is the year it happened, this was who was involved, and you're like, oh, geez. You're like, so you mean to tell me somebody sat down and made up that much detail and explanation and backstory and then you're like, that's not even logical. That's not even reasonable to think that somebody could do that. So then it sounds very true when you look at it historically and logically, but emotionally and based on my Sikhi philosophy, and you could call it post-colonial mentality, whatever it is, I have a very hard time wrapping my head around that the Guru would have multiple wives. Still. This
is the thing. So like you said, it's not debatable. Like I should be clear, like you could say from an ideological perspective, and that's what is happening here, right? You're saying like, that idea like Jito and Sundari Mataji's are the same person, but the name is switched. That's not a textual argument because like you were saying, there's so much detail. So that detail, like, that detail from the podcast in relation to Guru Har Gobind, that detail is also there. If you look at these texts for Guru Gobind Singh, Mata Jito comes from this family. This was her life. She passes away here. Mata Sundari, carries on. She's in Delhi for some time. She's writing Hukamname. So that amount of details there as well. You can make that argument as well. Like, Guru Gobind Singh never had a grishti in the sense of the marriage was never consummated with Mata Sahib Deva. And that is something that's written in the tradition at that time, that Guru Gobind Singh did not consummate that marriage. You find that in pre-colonial texts as well.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But so that is mentioned. That is mentioned. But yeah, I mean, it is interesting, right? Why is it uncomfortable? Like then we start peeling back layers about, okay, where is my source? Where's my perspective? Where's my ideas coming from? Is it coming from the Western conception about marriage? Is it coming from how I've interpreted Sikhi? Like, and these are questions that I've had as well. Like I'm trying to think through this as well. Other people have these questions as well, especially when you look at Gurbani of Dasme Pasha, like Guru Gobind Singh, in terms of his writings on Dasam Granth, right? A lot of us would have the idea that, and it's an honest opinion, and it should be treated as an honest opinion, just like as we see in the stories of Guru Har Gobind. Those Sikhs who were questioning Guru Har Gobind, they were not like especially evil people.
Right.
They had a different conception of what Sikhi was, right?
Right.
For them, Sikhi wasn't wearing a sword which would rip somebody in half. To them, they saw that and they were like, that is like astonishingly demonic to wear a weapon. And that was their honest opinion, right? They understood Sikhi in a different lens, and albeit deviant from how the tradition went from there on afterward.
But you know what? There's something interesting there too, because I always compare a Granth in Guru Sahib's time was their most modern technology, that was their media. That was how they got information. And think about how slow that process is. Take this bead, take it and go make copies, then take those copies and distribute them here, and then educate people on how to do katha from, like such a slow process, but that was the best technology they had. That was their media, so that made sense that different people are going to have very different interpretations or different ideas about Sikhi, and the changes will be shocking because you have this one idea and then you go and you see, oh, things are progressing, but they're not progressing based on what my previous understanding was. Whereas today, the Guru could just go on YouTube and go live to the whole world and say, this is what I'm talking about.
Totally. The media has totally changed, but I do agree with you that, the writings of the Guru are ways to kind of convey the philosophy, the ideas, the ras, the experience that the Guru wants to kind of imbue within his Sikhs, for sure. There are ways to encode that in a way that kind of hopefully continues on the meanings and the traditions that they wish. Like a lot of people ask why Ladivar, like the kind of writing Gurbani, kind of conjoined. Why was that a tradition? And I think that it does give us hints to, ways in which it requires certain amount of training. And in that training, then you're also prescribing like, how are these texts to be interpreted over time? And so, those type of mediums and those type of ways of conveying information can hopefully retain meaning over time. But yeah, for sure. It's
no, I don't mean to imply that the Guru, instead of creating a Granth, would now just have a YouTube channel. I don't mean to say that. I'm just saying, like, you can see the movement of information, how slow it would be compared to today. Right. So keeping that in mind, it's interesting to see how people that maybe met Guru Nanak Dev Ji and never met any of the other gurus, how they practice. And then, because, Guru Nanak Dev Ji traveled everywhere, right? So, and then you could see how somebody who maybe was in Guru Gobind Singh's time might have a totally different impression of what a Sikh is.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that because, just recently in the Suraj Podcast, there was a portion where Guru Hargobind met with the lineage of Guru Amar Das Ji, and he met with Sundar Ji. He's very famous. He's the great grandson of Guru Amar Das Ji, I believe. And even Sundar Ji asks, and Sundar has a component in Guru Granth Sahib. He's written this Bani called Sad, and it's in Rag Ramkali. And even as it's described in the text, Sundarji is asking Guru Hargobind, like, what's the deal? Like, you've adorned all these weapons. You're now in battles with the Mughal Empire. Like, this is such a departure from previous gurus, but he's asking it very genuinely. It's not a question or a critique. It's just like, help me. This is different. Help me understand this difference. And that's such a humble way of approaching it as well, because, as mentioned in Gurbani and in these stories of Guru Hargobind, like when he talks about what's the root of Sikhi, the root of it is nimrta, right? Humility. Right. And it's like in that ground of humility where Sikhi can take birth. If you don't have that, you have no foundation, right? And it's like, that's such a good way for all of us to think about these old texts as well. It's like, okay, Dasam is different than Ad Guru Granth Sahib. I don't understand the difference, but that's my fault. That's not the fault of the text. People have these all the time where it's just like, okay, there's something different in the tradition here. I don't understand it, so that means it must be wrong. Like, there's a lot of stories about Guru Hargobind and Guru Gobind Singh, actually, where there's this one story that comes up where Sangat comes from Banaras, So congregations come from East India, and they come to see Guru Har Gobind. At the time, Guru Har Gobind has a hawk on his hand, and he's like feeding it meat, and which means like obviously that meat was cut up from another animal. Hawks have to live with meat. You're not like feeding it like milk or whatever. And the Sangha is seeing this, the blood on the Guru's hands, and he's feeding another animal to this animal. And they're like, man, this is so weird. Guru Nanak and his lineage support hunting and the killing of animals. And, you know, how does this make sense? And the Guru explains to him, you know, in a way that that person would understand, talking about, listen, you don't understand, you know, Charasi anyways, the cycle of life and birth. So let me explain to you that, you know, there's some story that relates to why we're doing this. But that comes up a lot in these stories as well, which is so interesting to know. Just as researchers and people who look back at Sikh history, it's like, oh yeah, people also were confused about certain things. How do we interpret this? Why are the Gurus doing this? Like, this is not new. These questions are not new, which is why it's so awesome to kind of read of old. Like, how did people engage with this? Because I think that's one thing that you're right when you're talking about like Vaisakhi, like everybody has a kind of this like, they think everybody was just on board with everything and everybody was so chardikala and everything worked out so amazing. It's like, it's a lot more gray than that. And it's actually a lot more fun when you realize that, like, yeah, people were human, people were confused, people needed answers. And that's why there was a guru to kind of guide people through these situations.
It also makes it so much more important. It shows you the value of the Panch Pyare. In that confusion, in that doubt, in that fear people are feeling, that makes it that much more significant that the Panch Pyare did that, you know. And that's why I'm always, like I said, I'm always looking at these texts for clues instead of like specific answers, you know. And then I have to also accept that even the clues I get and the interpretation I make could be wrong. But I got to go with what makes the most sense to me also, you know, because the history is inspiring to me, but really the source is Gurbani. For me, Gurbani is what everything centers around. So even if history conflicts with it, and logically my brain might say, well, that history makes sense, but it conflicts with something that I understand in Gurbani, I just won't accept it or implement it in the way I practice Sikhi. Right? And so I can separate things like that out, but I can understand why it's difficult for a lot of people. Like, for example, I wanted to ask you this because it does come up in the Suraj Prakash, the miracles the Gurus are doing. What are your thoughts? Like, do you believe that the Gurus were doing miracles? Like, you personally, I know I've also noticed that you've been very good about putting everything in context and saying everything, but you don't really interject too much your thoughts and what you believe.
That's largely because, you know, what I believe is going to change over time, and what I believe is highly subject to error and fault. And so I kind of defer to the greats and see how they wrote it and try to understand how they wrote it in this way. Like Bhai Gurdas himself is talking about Guru Nanak Dev Ji, you know, performing miracles. And specifically relating to the Siddha Gosht, event. So how do we interpret that? Do we interpret that as, you know, this is some type of literary trope or kind of device that are being employed for specific reasons? Are we to understand that as, for example, when you're young, you think, yeah, my dad could move a mountain, you know, and that's a really good thing to have as a kid. You know, it's even you look back at that idea when you're little and you think fondly of that, you know what I mean? And then later on you get older and perhaps a little bit more cynical and you're like, my dad is just a dude, or my, grandfather is just a dude and I'm a dude and we're all the same and everybody makes mistakes and all this type of stuff. You can take that perspective. But you do realize that at certain points of your development, you need to hold on to certain ideas to get you through life. Like when you're little, that idea that, okay, my mom and my father are around and I'm safe now because they can stop anything. They can do anything they want. That's really comforting. And that's really an idea that's certainly pushed in Gurbani, that the Guru and Paramatma, the divine, is like that they can make anything happen and they can support you. And so I think that is an important perspective to take. I do understand the flip side of that perspective is that if the Guru is like Superman, and if they can do anything, then is it even meaningful, the fact that they were on a hot metal plate like Guru Arjan Dev Ji? There's a perspective that suggests that it's less meaningful, that if they could sustain that without feeling anything, then it's like, okay, well, whatever. That's just like him eating ice cream. Like there's no difference. Right. But if you think of it from the perspective of they endured that pain and still they didn't like waver at all, then you're like, oh man, that's so meaningful that the Guru went through that pain knowing that he could have stopped it. But he still persevered. And that gives you inspiration that if there's, any type of dukh sukh that comes in my life, that I'm going to try to channel that. I'm going to try to think about that. And that's my ideal. So there's different perspectives that are worthwhile to engage in and to embody depending on the circumstance of one's own life. And I think that's why, in my mind, that these poets and these authors are writing the histories in these ways to kind of appeal to a variety of audiences who might need certain things at certain times. So that's one way to think about it. And that's the way I like to think about it as well, to be honest.
Interesting. I guess in context, so simple. Sorry.
Just to add to that, when just because you're going to be talking about Vaisakhi coming up very soon, it's like there's various perspectives about what happened that day, right? Some perspective is that, so if you read like Ratan Singh Pangu, Panth Prakash, you read Suraj Prakash, there's a tent there, and the tent, the Guru, calls somebody in. He emerges out of the tent with a bloody sword, and in the text, it's kind of going behind the curtains and saying, "Yeah, there was a goat there." The Guru chopped the goat's head off, and he came out, and he was playing a charitra. He was playing a trick of deception on the Sangat, in a sense, right? And if you look at it through that light, it's very, it's entertaining, and it's really interesting how the Guru's doing this. Or if you look at the light that, the Guru's actually chopping somebody's head off, and then through the miracle of the Guru can give life and take life and kind of restore life. If you take that miracle to be true, then that makes sense. But those people who get really, that's a very heated, controversial topic. People get very emotional about it when you say, okay, maybe there's a tent there, and the Guru was playing kind of a trick and kind of testing his Sikhs, right? Because then they say, oh, you don't believe the Guru can do a miracle, and that is offensive to some people.
Or that the Guru would have to test anybody that he would know.
Yeah.
Right. You're right. Like it gets whatever. But I guess for me, I'm thinking of it like, okay, Baitaru Singh's story. Zakir Khan is he can't go to the bathroom, right? And they tell him you have to get Baitaru Singh's chappal and beat him in the head. And every time he would get beat in the head, he would relieve himself a little bit more, and that's what it took. Like that's a kind of a miraculous story, but to me that's not that hard to accept. Okay, but then one story that does bug me is Baba Bakala. Guru Har Krishan Ji is on his deathbed and he says Baba Bakala. So now you have Makhan Shah Labana on a boat doing Ardas, and Guru Sahib says to him, bring me 500 gold pieces, whatever. And now word gets out and all these people show up there, and he starts passing out one gold coin. And then when he gets to Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji, he says, well, where's the rest of the money? Right? Then they, he's the Guru. Now he's the Guru. Right? That always bugged me because I thought, why wouldn't Guru Har Krishan Ji just say, Uncle Tegh Bahadur? I mean, it's his dying words. He still said Baba Bakala. He could have just said Uncle Tegh Bahadur. And
could have been specific.
yeah. And it would have like solved all the problems. Because then it's almost like you're creating a story, or I shouldn't say it's created because I don't really know, but the story has to have this miraculous component to it Otherwise, we wouldn't know who the next guru would be. Whereas all along, the gurus were very clear, passing on Gurgaddi because they didn't want confusion. That one always bugged me. So I have a harder time swallowing that whole story as a whole. But there's other ones I accept rather easily. I'm like, okay, yeah, maybe that happened. Maybe that's how, some of the Guru Nanak Dev Ji stuff,
Yeah. I would say, I talked extensively about this on, so if you check Jvala Singh YouTube channel, there's one merit, a myth, and there's also one on Karg Singh. Karg Singh is a prasang, a passage out of Dasam Granth that talks about a warrior whose head is chopped off and continues to battle, just like is mirrored in how we talk about Baba Deep Singh. Like the Baba Deep Singh story is kind of equivalent to what you're talking about. It's a myth. It's a story that, and I don't mean myth in a negative sense, is a story that Baba Deep Singh is a warrior. He gets his head chopped off. He continues fighting. And people take that also very seriously in the sense that if you say that, oh, perhaps the head didn't entirely come off, people get really offended about that. Yeah. And all I would say, just like in the same thing about Guru Tegh Bahadur you mentioned, is that if you think that, okay, I feel a little bit uncomfortable about that story, I don't know how to take it, do what you did with the Batman reference, right? What's happening underneath that? What's happening underneath that is saying that Guru Tegh Bahadur is Antarjami. He's the one who reads, who knows all hearts. And when you think about the divine, that's a characteristic that's drawn out in Guru Granth Sahib as well, that the divine is kind of residing within everybody's heart and knows everybody's heart, knows what everybody's thinking. Yeah. And they're trying to utilize that characteristic, that gun, that virtue, and playing that out through a storytelling technique with the story of Guru Tegh Bahadur and that, getting Gurgaddi. So I would always say there's always a deeper level you can go in these stories. And that's why I find these stories so fascinating, is that they work on a variety of levels. So for example, that level where like somebody says, I don't think your dad could move that mountain. As a kid, you're going to be like, oh, my dad could do anything. Yeah. In the same sense, stronger than
your dad. He can do anything.
Yeah. Right. And at the same sense, like they're writing for like such a broad audience. And I think that, what we have not been good at in the West so far is kind of explaining that deeper level of understanding that what is myth in terms of storytelling. What is it actually doing? Like, how is it penetrating different audiences in different ways and
really
making
interesting.
And that's something that I think people in the West are doing very well when they're studying storytelling and myth. And that's something that I am looking at as well, like how to interpret these pre-colonial stories.
Yeah. You just said that and it kind of opened up my mind to a bunch of stuff. Like one thing is often in movies that are, documentary in style, but like it's actually a Hollywood film, but it's talking about real events. They'll often, because they know they have a 2-hour window, they have an audience, they have to tell this story. They'll often take like 3 characters from real life and combine them into one new character that they just make up so that they can tell the story of the main character and get all those components, because they can't go into, you only have 2 hours to tell a story. They do that all the time. One of the, Bruce Lee, Dragon Bruce Lee story. That movie that also takes like situations and tells them in different order to tell a movie so you get the point of how good Bruce Lee is, but historically inaccurate. So when you were saying that, kind of clicked with me. Like, I don't know how much people were accurately documenting real life with their works. It's just like the paintings. It always drives me crazy. They have a painting of an adult, then they draw a painting of a child, and it's just a small miniature version. The proportions are all off. I'm like, they're not even trying to capture, but then that's the whole point. They're not trying to capture it as realistically as possible. They're using their art techniques to tell a story. In the same way, when they're writing history, they don't see the value of historical accuracy. This happened on this date at this time. Specifically, he was walking in this direction. now I can kind of see that talking to you, like, okay, our Gurbani, our philosophy, all of that is done artistically. So maybe the history is just told artistically. They don't have a device for like we do today, where we're like, you know, document the minutes of exactly what happened. Right.
How boring would that be if we just had minutes of like, okay, you know, Guru Nanak Dev Ji woke up this time, then he had this to eat, and then he did this and that. You know, that would be very difficult to engage with. And that's why I think Gurbani and Itihas is also written in poetry, right? So even the historical stuff is written in poetry. Why? What does poetry do? Were they like incapable of writing outside of poetry? Santokh Singh did write outside of poetry when he's writing a commentary on Japji Sahib. You know, these people could write, you know, not in poetry, but they chose poetry. Why? Because it has a way to make you experience something in a very deep land.
It brings the emotions in.
Yeah. And that's what is meaningful, right? When you have emotion, like you can make a rational argument about this and that. And as we've seen in politics more recently, you just sidestep all the rational, you make an emotional plea, and that binds people in, people in who pride themselves on rationality. Yeah.
Right.
Even still, emotions are so deeply embedded within us that when you hear these stories, like you mentioned, Bande Khan, issues of jealousy, automatically you're like, oh, I've experienced jealousy.
Yes,
I know people who are jealous of me. You know, I've been jealous, you know, all of these type of things. And specifically in the Bande Khan story, how emotional that story gets. Like Guru Hargobind takes this person in who's an orphan, trains him up. Yeah. He becomes an elite member of the army. Other Sikhs are jealous of how elite he's become because he comes from a Pathan family. And then eventually you start to see his rise, and then his decline is happening right now on the podcast where we're recording this now in mid-April. He starts to get egotistical. He starts to separate from the Guru. He starts to, this is not giving away in any type of spoiler because this has already been covered, but you know, he ends up fighting against Guru Hargobind in Guru Hargobind's last battle. Guru Hargobind has to duel him himself and chops him up, and is so emotional when chopping him up because he had raised him like his own kid, right? And you know, Guru Hargobind, when Bande Khan's dying, Guru Hargobind says to him, okay, read your kalama, because he comes from an Islamic tradition. Kalama is something like they read, like how we read Kirtan Soila at the end when somebody's passing away. And then Bande Khan just says, you know, basically your sword has become my kalama now. Your sword has become that which is going to liberate me. So he's asking Guru Hargobind on his deathbed, like, yo, I've made a mistake. I have forgotten how divine you are. Please forgive me. Like, and Guru Hargobind, that struck Guru Hargobind so bad. Like Guru Hargobind took a knee, put a shield over Bande Khan's dying body. Tears were rolling out of the Guru's eyes onto Bande Khan's mouth. And Guru Hargobind is just thinking like, man, you know, water does not, like a tree is grown through water, but water will never drown a piece of lumber. Lumber, like trees, will always rise up, float. Because why? Because water is what gave the tree birth. Like water is what grew it out. And Guru Hargobind is thinking that I raised this kid who was an orphan, and now I have chopped him down, you know? And Guru Hargobind is just kind of thinking about the calamity, the catastrophe of this, you know, of this jung, which did not need to happen, right? It happened because of Bande Khan's ahankar, his ego, and all of that. And the Guru was put in such an awkward position where he had to kill like somebody that, you know, in all accounts, like if you read the text, Guru Hargobind really has an affinity with this warrior of his who's training so hard, who's earning his way up through the ranks, etc.
Well, no, even as a listener, you feel that. Like as a listener, when I'm listening to it, I'm rooting for the guy. I'm like, oh, they're jealous of him, but he's stronger. He's, you know, like when you follow along, you also feel invested in this person. So to see how it goes down, you're like, oh my God, this is horrible. Like if only he had stayed on track. And then we know people in our lives, Sikhi wise, that were in Sikhi, maybe they fall off track, they get on a different track, and they like abandon Sikhi, and you feel bad about you can relate those kinds of feelings, like what it feels like, because there's a sense of betrayal, and then there's some sadness, and then you still have that feeling like, man, we were really good friends, and that's lost now. So yeah, there was a lot of that, like, it comes across so clearly. It really makes it easy to listen to and just draws you in, so you've done an excellent job with that part of it. One technical question though, am I hearing you say Khan, like Khan instead of Khan? Like I say it like maybe how American, I don't know. I'm just saying Khan with the hard N. You kind of say a softer N. Is that specifically on purpose?
Perhaps, yeah. I think more specifically, I'm probably even pronouncing it wrong. They definitely don't say it over there as Khan with a hard N. Okay. They might say that in the West here, but it's more like kakenu kanna bindi, like Khan or Khan. It's actually like it's like kaka with a bindi at the bottom, so it's more like ha. It's like Khan.
Yeah.
It's I'm certainly pronouncing that wrong as well, but Khan with a hard N is not how they pronounce that. But
interesting.
But yeah, it's just,
I was thinking that. I was like listening to you. I'm like, I think he's saying it, and I was like, that must be on purpose. And I know you're like this Punjabi expert. I mean, that's what you're at Berkeley. You're teaching Punjabi. That's what you're teaching there, right?
Correct. Yeah. So I'm trying to get it more to how they say it, but also not deviating too far that if I say like, that nobody's people will be like, what did he just say?
Yeah.
So this is also like in translation, you have to like find a way to kind of convey it in a way that people are going to know what you're talking about. So
yeah, interesting. We have this problem, I think in general. I know a lot of younger people like you are trying to change things, but we have this problem in general where there's no depth to anything. Everything is like little presentation tricks, or they're like, just very generic. And then people make stuff up too. I hear some people talking. I'm like, you just made that up. That doesn't come from anywhere.
Yeah.
We don't really have this authoritative kind of source, and you've kind of created that now, right? You've created this thing that people can reference back and say, okay, how did that story go? What happened there? Go back and listen to it and kind of refresh your memory, take notes. I mean, you could, I mean, I'm really looking forward to upcoming episodes. I think about how vastness of this, writing. I don't know. It's going to take you forever. It's going to take decades.
Yeah, I mean, Santokh Singh himself took basically 10 years writing this flat out. Like, that's a lot of time to dedicate. And Veer Singh himself, when he published this, took about the same amount of time in publishing it. Just editing it, publishing it. So it's like an enormous text. And in regard to making stuff up, that was something that I really wanted to... Like, I provide context and I provide some insight, which I think would be helpful when listening to the podcast. On the side, I add some stuff, but really, I wanted to really defer and just lean on what the text has to offer, because it has a lot to offer. And like you said, it's very detailed. And I think that's something shocking that if you guys have not listened to the Suraj podcast, you guys will come to understand is how detailed of a history that we do have that is written down.
Right.
That is not recent. Like, we can look back and like, how did the greats, the legends of old, how did they think about Guru Har Gobind at that time, and the relations with the Sikhs and the battles and all of that? Like, this, it's written in such detail that it's such a treasure trove that is inaccessible to people that can not listen to Punjabi Katha or can't read Braj Pasha. So this is in many ways, I feel like we're just doing what the tradition has always done, is just make things more accessible. Like, why was Gurbani written in a language outside of Sanskrit?
Right.
Like, the Gurus could have written in Sanskrit if they wanted and had like 5 people read it. Like,
they made it in the common language. Yeah,
exactly. Right. And then after that, when you have like these histories that were written, also written in the language that people would understand at that point, right? And nowadays, we have people writing in English and that. But to be honest, I found the old stuff more enjoyable, and you can just tell like how much flavor and the storytelling, like how beautifully it's constructed in terms of storytelling, and the kind of images that it depicts. You can't.
No, but that's the whole thing, right? Like you're providing an authenticity to the original work. I think that's the biggest problem. That's what I was trying to say. You just said it better. Is that a lot of people, that what they say or what they write in English today isn't authentic to the sources. It's an interpretation of it and a watering down of it, actually. And when nuance is lost, see, that was the whole key. That's why I was saying like the Vaisakhi thing. People thinking the Guru is crazy. The nuance is what makes that story powerful. When that gets lost, then the whole story becomes something different, and it's not even relatable. It's not even understandable then as a story itself. It starts to just sound like some story. Maybe it happened, maybe it didn't, like it starts to become like that. So I think staying authentic, the fact that you're doing it in English reaches way bigger audience, even Punjabi speaking people. The English is going to help them. And if we can get more people to listen, see, I think this is the challenge I run into. Like my upbringing has more been with Akhand Kirtani Jatha. Okay. That's who after 84 is when we got into Sikhi. We had Sangat that was Taksali, Akhand Kirtani. And then, we met people from missionary backgrounds and other people too. So I kind of had this broad thing, but the core Maryada I followed, or the core group that I spent time with, was mostly Akhand Kirtani Jatha. And that is a very specific view of Sikhi and very specific style of Maryada, right? There's not a lot of history reading going on in the Jatha. Okay. So, yeah. And I tell people, I'm like, look, you should read it. You should know it. If you think it's going to waver your faith in Sikhi, then don't read it. Just keep doing what you're doing. But it shouldn't be that way. If your faith is truly in the Guru, then it shouldn't waver your faith. It should just give you some reference or clarity about what our history actually is, whether you believe it or not. Ratan Singh Pangu was the grandson of somebody in Guru Gobind Singh's direct contact. He's way closer to what happened, and he saw the results of the formation of Khalsa army and what was happening. He was there living the results of it. We may not accept or believe everything he says, but he has a completely different viewpoint than we have several hundred years later, looking back on it, trying to reinterpret it, because we make movies and that, like cartoons that have like a certain look and feel to them. And then we imagine that's how it is. And then we dress like that when we go to the Gurdwara, and we think, okay, that is making us closer. And really none of that is reality. So I try to encourage people, listen to Suraj Podcast. You don't believe in Dasam Granth? Go listen to the people that are pro Dasam Granth and hear what they're saying about it. You don't even know what you don't agree with yet. If you don't read Ragamala, you should know why people who read Ragamala continue to read it. This happened to me one time, because akj.org, I was one of the people that created that and built it. And I added a message board that changed everything. The whole site became a different beast altogether. And I remember I was an admin, but I was like a technical admin. I didn't really represent anything. I was just like I programmed and I did stuff. But I remember I posted one time about Ragamala. I posted the pros and cons, and I was like, just make up your own mind, but go out and understand both sides. Oh my God. I opened a can of worms with that. I got so much slack for how can an admin of this site put the pros of Ragamala? Like they only wanted to project the cons because they felt like it's confusing people to give them both sides of the story. So I've always been, sorry. I've always been advocating, even if you don't agree, understand what you don't agree with, and you might You might read all about Dasam Granth and why Dasam Granth is legitimate and everything, and reinforce your own belief that it's not all Guru Gobind Singh's Bani, right? You don't even know, because you don't know what people are saying. And it's the same with all of this. Like, I know a lot of people have asked me, they're like, well, Santokh Singh, he talks a lot of weird things about the Guru, and he says things. I'm like, have you read it? Do you know? Okay. Because even if you did, I don't think you would understand it. Go listen to this podcast. This is where the story of Bidhi Chand is coming from, right? Like, we all had the comic books as kids, and we all talked about Bidhi Chand and everything, but we don't even understand where that story is coming from, right? So I think it's really, really important. People need to open their minds, listen, read, whatever you can, but be confident in what you think and believe. Like, it's okay to interpret it yourself.
Yeah, it's a couple of things there. It's like, I think these texts are written in a way as well, which is appealing to a broad audience as well. So, for example, these portions about Guru Har Gobind going into the forest and hunting, right?
Yeah.
You can look at that from a variety of different perspectives. You could even look at that from a vegetarian sadhu type of mentality, which there's references in the text that support a certain perspective that would be taken by a vegetarian. Like, for example, the perspective that Guru Har Gobind is going into the forest to liberate these animals because there's a history of 84 lakh June that we don't know, and the Guru is going out there to liberate these. Those portions are mentioned. Like that is something that Santokh Singh throws, he'll throw a line or two here and there being like,
right.
The Guru, by the Guru's hand, these animals were liberated.
Right.
At the same time, there's another perspective that the Guru is going out to the forest, taking his Sikh Surame with him, his Sikh warriors with him, where they are practicing Shastra Vidya. And this is a component of martial training, where you're, hunting tigers, you're hunting deer, etc. And then there's a political, social component that's also mentioned, where it talks about the Guru, like, for example, this came up actually really recently. It was a tiger in a forest, and there was somebody out there who was, with cows and buffaloes, he's giving his animals out to pasture, etc. They had to eat, and the tiger goes, kills some buffalo, some cows, and the Sikh is like, what am I going to do? I have all these animals, but there's a tiger in this forest. Help me. And the Guru goes out and hunts that tiger. And this is something that people of that time would do, because, we sit in the West and we're kind of so far removed from these societies where tigers were real harm to people in society. And like, even today now in India, you have tigers that kill and wound, maim, like, thousands of people, literally thousands. If you Google it, you'll find stories of India where certain areas are just, tiger attacks are so common.
Yeah.
So, and because we don't have that context.
You're talking about a tiger. I know a story, and this story was told to me by somebody about his family. They're all very strict vegetarian, but he talked about hunting. He said they had their farm fields, and I don't know if it's access deer or some other kind of deer. They come in these like hordes, and they run through and they trample all the crop and destroy all the crop, and then it'll ruin your life. And what they would do is they would kill those deer. They would hunt them so that they wouldn't trample their crops, and then they would dump the body. They were like, we used to dump the body. There was outside of the village or whatever, there was an area where you could dump these dead animal bodies. So they were doing it for their own survival, for their crops, for their own livelihood. And it wasn't a direct threat of like some, like a tiger. So this is deer, which a lot of vegetarians would say, oh, that's wrong. But, he's like, you had to do that. Otherwise, your crops are ruined.
That's the thing. It's like, there's so many conditions and circumstances which we are unaware of. Yet we're so easy to judge, right? And all I'm saying with all of those examples are there's many different reasons why the Guru could be performing one action, right? Okay. And for us to just have one type of mentality to be like, in my perspective, this is incorrect. It's like, you don't know all the various dimensions in which the Guru is acting. So how are we to judge? Number one. And number two is like, when you're talking about the authors are way closer to the reality. This is something that I find so funny. It's like, for example, people will be like, oh, Santokh Singh came 100 years after Guru Gobind Singh. How is he going to know? It's like, how are we going to know?
How do we know that?
Because we like casually read Gurbani like every now and then.
I'll tell you what one of the things is. There's going to be this idea that someone who is more closer to being a Brahmgyani or higher up, they have revelations, and those revelations they're not going to butt. Now that Gursikh, that specific Gursikh was such a great Gursikh, the Maryada and everything was revealed to them by Guru Sahib and themselves through, bhakti, meditation, whatever. And that is the truth. So whatever you've read has been written incorrectly because this one person in the 20th century had a revelation. So for me, it's like, okay, that's no different than reading anything else then. It actually is worse because anybody could claim that, right?
That's a real double-edged sword. That's a real double-edged sword. That's kind of, we're definitely getting the other edge right now in the community where no doubt there've been very spiritually enlightened people and scholars of the community. And, for a vast population, a good size of the community, perhaps their need is just, they're not going to read a lot. They're not literate. Until recently, people were becoming literate in large numbers. So, they took with good, they just listened to the people who were close to them, and that's all they could do, and all power to them, because they didn't have the means to kind of branch out. And I think we have the means now to kind of look back and kind of spread what has been the gold standard for many generations. And we're providing that in a way like why is there music on it, right? To help with the reception of these these stories, right? And that's why these things were, first of all, written in poetry, is to help with the reception. So it's not a deviation from that tradition. And now we're able to kind of reach those people who are never going to be able to read Suraj Prakash or these type of texts, and you can reach them. And yeah, I mean, there's also a lot of deception that occurs in the community because of people who are put on a pedestal. And that doesn't mean everybody put on pedestals are incorrectly put on them. But Guru Gobind Singh himself writes about this a lot. And I think that's a major reason why he writes Charitropakhyan, like these stories about deception and how people get deceived through a variety of different ways. Like that's text is often associated purely with the romantic and the sexual. But if you read the stories in there, they're also talking about, how people play on religion, how people play on these notions that one can be a holy person or a holy man, and they abuse those, positions.
Yeah, and we see it. We can see that. It's a reality. There's scandals in the Sikh community. I had Gurpreet Kaur from the Kaur movement. I had her on a couple of episodes ago. She's exposing people that are using their position as, experts or priests, for lack of a better word, and exactly that. They're using it for their own pleasures and their own gains. And so we can see in real life these things are happening, but I understand. I mean, I don't pick one way or the other. I just say I don't know enough, but I want to learn. I want to know what's being said, how it's being interpreted, because I think I mentioned this on the episode with Amar Singh, because he had Kamal Roop on, and Kamal Roop gave me different perspectives on some of the stories I'd heard many times from one side, like, but that can't be Guru Sahib because he would never be in a situation like who else, like that story that I think it's a Noop Kaur, Guru Gobind Singh talks about the Prince of Anandpur, and everybody's like, well, there is no Anandpur Sahib before, so it could only be Guru Gobind Singh, and how would he ever be in a situation like that? But Kamal Roop put a twist on it. He goes, well, a twist as far as what I'd heard. You probably already knew this, but he said Guru Sahib's talking to the Singhs and he's telling a funny story, and they're all when they hear Prince of Anandpur Sahib is in this situation, like they're all laughing because they know he could never be in a situation like this. But he had a point to make. He was making a point about not letting your guard down and getting yourself in a position where you could be compromised. But he did it in a funny way. when I heard that, I was like, wow, I can totally see that now. Makes a lot of sense. The Gurus had personality. They weren't just these dry conveyors of, here's Turki Bani and follow it, and here's the Maryada and follow it. They had personality, and they had, they engaged with the people around them in ways that excited people.
Yeah, that's such an interesting thing to say. It's like the actions of the Guru, we can think of them as having pedagogical importance, meaning the actions themselves taken by the Guru are teachings. So, for example, this is something explicitly mentioned, which I found so interesting about Guru Hargobind. And just like the most recent episode, I think, is Guru Hargobind reciting Sukhmani Sahib in the morning, just before sunrise, waking up early, Amrit Vela. And it says, to carry on or to kind of spread this tradition amongst his Sikhs, he sat there and recited Sukhmani Sahib in a very high pitch and a loud, enthusiastic manner. You know what I mean? It's like, what need is there for Guru Hargobind to recite Sukhmani Sahib? He himself is like the divine, right? You can make that argument. Like you could say that, like, why would the divine, why would the Guru himself need to do Part and Bani and that type of stuff, right? Yeah. But there it's saying, he's showing Sikhs, okay, now the Sikhs are going to be like, Guru Hargobind himself used to do this. I'm going to do this. And that's something that is so awesome that people can pick across the traditions. Like, for example, also in a recent podcast, it talks about Guru Hargobind's physical training. And it says that he's sitting there watching his soldiers, do weighted club exercises, do push-ups, do running, do, target practice unloading, practice loading their rifles and all that type of stuff. And he enjoys it. He's being happy when people are getting proficient at it. He's like, okay, that's awesome. You're doing well here. Yeah. This guy's good at grappling. That guy's good at, and then people can take that. And when they're training, after work, they're like, oh man, should I lift these weights? And be like, and then they can picture Guru Hargobind smiling, be like, man, I should lift that weight. That'd be awesome to do that. Yeah. So it's there's pedagogical reasons for these things as well. And that's another thing, like you mentioned earlier, it's like, okay, something's mentioned, there's stories about this, or this was a tradition. If you don't understand it, that's it. You don't understand it, and perhaps you will come to understand it.
Yeah, but we say that with Gurbani all the time, right? Like we say, you read this Bani sometimes and you're struggling, because it's telling you buying a big house is a waste. Being attached to your family is, all this stuff. You read that Gurbani and then you go, wait, is it really so bad that I love my son so much? Is it really so bad that I bought this house in a good school district? We are struggling with it anyway when it comes to Gurbani. For some reason, we can't carry that attitude over when it comes to other things. But
that's so smart.
I think the work you're doing is actually helping with that. I'm telling you, it opened up my mind and my perspective to so many things. And I really hope other people will follow that example and listen. Just listen to it. You don't have to agree with it all. You don't have to believe it all 100%. Just listen to it and understand and get the feeling I get, the inspiration I get is I think about, like, I hear the Sikhs and how much they love the Guru. Like we all say that we love our Guru, that we're going to give our head to the Guru, we're going to do all of this. But you hear the stories of how they love the Guru, the way that, like you have a bigger brother or you have like a role model and you really love that guy and you can't wait to go hang out again. And just, that's the feeling you get. You start to understand, like, people, when they're saying they want darshan of the Guru, yes, there's a spiritual aspect there, but they really just want to see him. They want him to come to their house and eat some food in their house. And we have that in our real lives. When your friends come over, you want to give them something good to eat. And if you've ever been 100%. To someone's house who they don't want you there, like this used to happen. I don't know how much I should say, but like, some auntie would be like, "Oh, great, Ricky's here. He's gonna eat all our food or whatever." Everybody calls me Ricky, by the way. I know my name's Mandheer Singh, but he's gonna eat all our food. He's gonna do this. That feeling, and you don't feel like eating. You don't feel like being there. We know those feelings. So when you hear about how, they're longing to see the Guru. Which those analogies are in Gurbani of our relationship to the Guru, of our relationship to Waheguru. But there is also that real life thing. Then you connect it to, do I feel that way about Guru Granth Sahib? I have Guru Granth Sahib at the Guru, or at the Gurdwara. I have Guru Granth Sahib Prakash in our house. Am I feeling that kind of longing that I need to go see the Guru and read the Guru and understand the Guru and engage with the Guru? Because they did. And in Suraj Prakash, there's so many examples of these Gursikhs that did. They truly were like attached to the Guru. And that's inspiring. That's very inspiring.
100%. It makes it real, right? Like you're now drawing analogies to, real life. And that's the point of all of these stories, I think, as well. It's like, we have Gurbani kind of played out in this real life situation. Like, for example, like these interactions of Guru Har Gobind and his Sikhs, right? We're seeing how Gurbani manifests in real life. Like, what does it mean to be a pyara, like a devotee, a beloved of the Guru? And what does it mean for the Guru to love his Sikhs as well, right? Like when Bidhi Chand passes away, the Guru tears up, right? Yeah. And this is something that it mentions in Chopai Sahib as well. Like the divine is pained at when his Sikhs are in pain, right? Right. And so it's really interesting that you mentioned like in Gurbani, like, people, we kind of a throwback to earlier in the podcast, you mentioned like controversial bits about sukha, like cannabis. Can you go a page or maybe 2 or 3 pages of Guru Granth Sahib without finding like stuff about, listen, your family is not going to come with you and your house is just garbage anyways. Why do you like these things? There's always these injunctions here, but it doesn't mean you don't have a family. The Gurus had families, right? It's just, there's ways that we naturally contextualize that because of the tradition that we're following in. Like we know the Guru's married, so it's okay for us to get married, but it's not okay for us to just be totally absorbed in the family where we lose our connection with something that's greater than just our body, their bodies, social commitments, etc. There's a divine, that there's a spiritual that's within every component of the world, right? And that we should be connected with. We naturally understand that because of our conditioning in today's Sikhian society, that we do marriages, but it's not to be attached to. In the same way, food, like on the podcast, there's references to like jalebis and this and that and all these type of foods, which is interesting as well. Yeah. But it's like Gurbani has references. It's like, don't get like too consumed with like eating all these fancy foods, this and that and stuff. Does it mean never having them? Or does it mean, you can have them, but like don't get absorbed in them if you're like obsessed with them all the time, right?
It's interesting because when you think about a lot of that imagery, like jaise gunge ki mithai, right? Like the idea that, someone who doesn't know how to speak could explain, what sweets taste like. That's the kind of feeling naam is or whatever. But, and that's a nice one. That's the one that we feel happy about, or like a chatrik wanting the boon, the raindrop, but there's also like the drug addict, the amali, like, imagine someone in an alley with a needle in his arm, getting high and just rolling their eyes back in their head. Guru Sahib also uses that example to describe what naam feels like.
There's so many different metaphors used, right?
But we don't. But nobody is saying, "Oh yeah, we should use drugs," because that analogy is there. Somehow we interpret it the other way. We're like, "Oh yeah, never touch drugs because you can't." Guru Sahib says not to use drugs. Well, Guru Sahib also used the analogy in a positive way. I'm not saying that to condone any kind of drug use. I'm just saying
it's funny because that's the line that people pick out, right? Pao tera pang, like my like fear or admiration of the divine is my cannabis. Yeah. Right. But there's also lines of Gurbani that's like my food, pao khana pina. There's a line like this where it says like my fear of the divine is my food and my drink. Does that mean we're not allowed to have any type of food or drink?
Can't eat food or drink anything.
We should only have the fear of the divine as our consumption. That's not what it's not an injunction. It's not saying that, and under absolutely no condition can we eat anything or drink anything, right? So all I'm saying is that you're absolutely right. Like the way in which we interpret Gurbani is socially conditioned to how we are now. And I would just say, let's step back from that a little bit with some nimrta and just say, the legends, the giants of our community, Bhai Mani Singh, Ratan Singh Pangu, Kavi Santokh Singh, these people wrote something. Maybe we don't agree with it fully today, and that's okay. Like, we don't have to agree with everything, or understand everything. Like, understanding everything is a far task. That is going to probably never happen, right? The depths of these writings are beyond our capabilities, even if we may be able to read the kind of superficial exterior meaning of it. All of which to say is that let's give deference, let's give a little bit of respect, and let's give them the benefit of the doubt a little bit, even if we don't understand it, because we have to, as a Sikh, take the approach of nimrta that, listen, I don't understand it, but what do I know?
Right.
Like, meri mat thodi ram, right? Like, I have such a little intellect. We should embody that to say that, okay, I don't understand much. What did the people before us, what did they write about?
Yeah, and, I do agree with you, and I don't think you're not saying what I'm about to say. But ultimately, the Guru's Bani is the ultimate. Like, when you say the legends, the Gurus were the biggest legends. The Gurus are the ones that we're going to follow. So, and I think that, again, kind of coming back to like people's mentality, that we all agree on. If whether you're on Dasam Granth or not Dasam Granth, Ragmala or not, meat or no meat, whatever the controversial topics you want to pick up and hold on to for dear life so that you can be in a battle with somebody else. Ultimately, we all have faith in the 10 Gurus. We believe in Guru Granth Sahib. We are on a path together, right? So ultimately, Gurbani overrides everything. So like, the Gurus are the ultimate legends, and the Gurbani, the message, is the ultimate thing. So if somebody says, I'm not into history, fine. Go read Gurbani, whatever. If you're happy, that's good. But don't be afraid of it. Don't be afraid to explore it. There's so much you can learn. Even if you don't believe it, there's so much you can pick up. Like we talked about with the stories, there's meaning there. Get that meaning out of it, and keep it in line with Gurbani. I think it's that simple. And then maybe we'll all get along a little bit better. That's kind of what I hope to, I want to accomplish that with this podcast. I always wanted that. I love debate. I love, all that kind of stuff, but I want it to be fun and enjoyable. And then at the end, everybody loves each other still. It's okay if we're on opposite ends of our Maryada and things like that, as long as we're all dedicated to whatever Maryada we're following, because it's the Guru's Maryada. Right? So,
no, absolutely. And just coming from the mouth of the Guru, there's a hukamnama that says, like, opus vich pyar rakhna, that everybody that he's writing to the congregation saying that, okay, everybody should come together and respect and love each other. Because,
you have that in the podcast where even when they're doing Vichar, Guru Hargobind Sahib is explaining how to do Vichar. And one of the things was, you do it in a loving manner, right? Like not in a adversarial way.
Yeah, no, because if it is adversarial, nothing's going to come out of it. So regardless of like whether somebody's actually genuinely looking for an answer on an issue, that there's going to be no solution unless both sides agree respectfully and lovingly that, okay, we both want to learn something here. How do we do that? Do you know about X subject? I know about Y subject. We can exchange. If it's going to be adversarial, nothing's going to happen, because there's very clever people who can twist an argument in a certain way. And, so yeah, just debating for the sake of debating is like nothing good is going to come out of that.
Right,
it's just going to be a waste of time.
Becomes an ego battle, right? We're not trying to have ego battles, but
100%.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think people would be shocked. Just to end off here, that if they have heard about Santokh Singh in a negative light, I do urge you to just dip your toe in and just listen to the Suraj podcast a little bit, because you will be shocked at how little of what you think is controversial that you'll find in there. I think the majority of it, the vast majority of it, you're going to enjoy. The writings of Kavi Santokh Singh, they're just brilliant writings. They're absolutely exquisite storytelling. And, Yeah, I think the components that perhaps don't sit well with you, you're going to find very little of that. And I do want to say, though, I am not editing anything out of that text. So, for example, I'm reading it as it lies. This parts in there I don't understand. I'm reading it as it is. I try to provide some context, and I always say that, like a little side note.
Yeah.
When I say that, I'm stepping outside of the text and providing my own context. But I am not, with my intellect, going into the text and editing, chopping stuff out, because I don't have that ability. And in the sense that, like, what do I know? I'm just trying to convey what the poet Santokh Singh has said. So I'm trying to do the best I can there. But there's no editing of the text. I read it as it lies. Yeah. And even then, I would say to you, everybody there, that you're going to find a lot more what you're going to enjoy than what you think is going to be controversial. So.
100%. That's what I found. I mean, I was curious and I was hooked right away. It's awesome. It's awesome work. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for coming on here and talking about it. I really, really appreciate it. I really hope people will go out. I'll put all your links into the description. If you have anything specifically you want to put in the description, just send it to me. But I really, really had a lot of fun talking to you, and I invite you to come back anytime you want. You want to talk about some of the other stuff we can talk about, or if you just want any topic, I would love to have you back.
No, let's do it. Yeah, this was a lot of fun. And I didn't think we were going to go close to 2 hours now. So for sure, we'll definitely jump on sometime soon. And chat some more. But I was happy to come on. This was really fun. So
awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Jvala Singh, thank you very much. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa.
Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.